The night Manhattan forgot its manners began the way most dangerous nights do, quietly and without warning, and in a room full of people who believed, with complete and entirely understandable confidence, that they had already figured out everything worth knowing about the world they were standing in. Outside the Alderton Grand, one of only 3 7-star hotels in the continental United States, November pressed its cold fingers against the glass, while inside, 12 stories above the city's indifferent noise, chandeliers dripped light over a gathering of people who had long since stopped worrying about the price of things. The private ballroom had been reserved for an invitation only evening, not a fundraiser, not a product launch, not even technically a party. It was what people at that level called a salon. A curated evening of conversation, culture, and competition. The kind of event where the chess sets were carved from obsidian and ivory, and the champagne came from a vineyard most people had never heard of, because most people had never been invited to hear about it. 43 guests in attendance, every one of them worth at least 9 figures. Every one of them performing, in their own way, the quiet theater of belonging, and standing at the center of that theater, as she almost always did, was Victoria Hale. At 36, Victoria had accomplished what most people spend their entire lives failing to imagine. She had built Hale Capital Group from a 2-room office in Midtown into a multi-billion-dollar investment empire with holdings on 4 continents. She had been on the cover of 3 financial magazines in the past 18 months alone. She had been called the most dangerous mind in private equity by a journalist who had clearly meant it as a compliment and slightly regretted it afterward. She was not especially tall, not conventionally striking in the way that the entertainment industry defined striking. But she had the kind of presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around her without being asked. Dark hair pulled back with surgical precision, a steel gray dress that cost more than most people's cars. Eyes, the color of deep water, and about as yielding. Victoria Hale did not suffer fools. She had made a philosophy of it, in fact, had refined it into something almost elegant in its ruthlessness. She believed and had believed since she was 19 years old and fighting her way through a finance program full of men who underestimated her that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who understood power and those who served it. She was not cruel about this belief, not openly. She simply acted on it the way a surgeon acts on anatomy. Clinically, without sentiment, with the confidence of someone who has studied the system long enough to stop questioning it. Chess, for Victoria, was more than a game. It was a mirror. She had learned it at 14 from her father, a quietly brilliant man who had won regional tournaments and never made it further because life, as life does, had other plans. She had absorbed not just his technique but his conviction that chess was the truest test of a certain kind of mind, strategic, patient, willing to think 4 moves ahead while the other person was still processing the second. She had beaten grandmasters at charity events. She had beaten hedge fund titans at private dinners. She had beaten a sitting senator once, though she was careful about where she told that story. In the world Victoria Hale inhabited, chess was not merely a pastime, it was a credential. And like all her credentials, she wore it with complete and unapologetic authority. The obsidian and ivory board had been set up near the east windows, the city's grid glittering below it like a circuit board designed to impress. A few of her guests had already gathered around it, a private equity director named Garrison, who fancied himself a player, a tech founder whose company had recently gone public, 2 women from a sovereign wealth fund who watched everything with the serene patience of people who had learned that watching carefully was its own form of power. Victoria moved toward the board with the ease of a person approaching something she owned, which, in a sense, she did not the board itself, but the evening, the room, the invisible architecture of expectation that had already decided how this night would go. She was reaching for the White Queen when she noticed the man standing near the far edge of the display. He was not a guest. That was the first thing anyone would have known. Immediately, and without question. Because his uniform said so, white shirt, dark vest, the discreet silver nameplate of the Alderton Grand service staff, all of it neat and well-fitted, and entirely, unmistakably, the clothing of someone who worked there, rather than someone who had paid to be there. He was perhaps 38, lean without being thin, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and the kind of face that was easy to look at and almost impossible to describe afterward, not because it lacked character, but because it carried the particular quality of someone who had spent years practicing invisibility. He stood perhaps 4 feet from the board. A small tray balanced in his left hand. An empty champagne flute, or two, still resting on it from an earlier round of service. But he was not looking at the flutes. He was looking at the board. His name, as the silver nameplate confirmed, was Daniel Mercer. He had worked at the Alderton Grand for 11 months. He was, by every official account, exactly what he appeared to be. A senior banquet server with a good performance record and a reputation among his colleagues for being quiet, reliable, and almost pathologically uninterested in making small talk. The other members of the service staff liked him well enough. He was never rude, never short-tempered, always willing to cover a shift, but few of them knew much about him. He read on his breaks, usually, history, mostly, or occasionally, something that looked like a mathematics textbook. Though no one had ever asked him about it directly. He had come to the hotel, the same way a lot of good people come to unexpected places, after something had changed in his life that required him to start over. On this particular Tuesday evening, Daniel was 40 minutes into a break between service rotations. He had come down this corridor not looking for anything specific, following the habit of a person who fills empty time with wandering rather than sitting still. He had heard, from the corridor, the faint click of chess pieces being placed and reorganized, the soft murmur of conversation from people examining the board, and something in him, something that had been quiet for a long time, something that had learned to stay quiet, had drawn him to the doorway, and then, very slowly, a few feet inside it. He was studying the position on the board. That much was clear to anyone who looked at him, though few had. The position was a moderately complex mid-game setup from what appeared to be an in-progress demonstration, the white pieces holding a slight positional advantage, the black queenside under subtle pressure that most casual players would not have identified for another 6 or 8 moves. Daniel identified it in roughly 20 seconds. He recognized the structure from a game played in a tournament he had not thought about in 3 years. And something in the recognition settled in him like a key, finding a lock, quietly, without drama. He was not the kind of man who showed what he knew on his face. He had learned that early, and the lesson had been reinforced thoroughly, but his eyes, to anyone paying very close attention, had gone very still. One person was paying close attention. A retired financier named Gerald Whitmore, 71 years old and in attendance that evening purely out of long friendship with the event's organizer, had positioned himself near the board display at an angle that let him observe both the chess position and the room around it. Gerald had spent 50 years reading people in boardrooms, in courtrooms as an expert witness, in the particular theater of high-stakes negotiation, and what he noticed in the serving staff member near the display was not curiosity. It was recognition, the quiet, internal, entirely controlled recognition of someone who had been somewhere before and was remembering it. Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it again. He watched for another moment. Then someone laughed loudly across the room, and the moment passed, and he decided he was probably imagining things, and he reached for his champagne. He was not imagining things. Victoria noticed the server the way she noticed most things that weren't immediately relevant to her peripherally, and with a slight hardening around the eyes that served as her version of irritation. She had been in the middle of a conversation about third-quarter portfolio performance and had turned slightly to the left, and there he was, a member of the hotel staff, standing inside the salon's perimeter, holding an empty tray and staring at her chessboard, not moving, not serving anyone, just standing there, watching the board, as if the setup of the pieces had something to say to him specifically. The conversation she'd been having trailed off. The people around her noticed the slight change in her attention and followed it. The way people at events like this always followed Victoria's attention, because experience had taught them it was usually pointing at something worth watching. "Excuse me," Victoria said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of voices trained by years of commanding large rooms. It projected without seeming to project, arrived everywhere it needed to arrive. She looked directly at Daniel. "Can I help you with something?" Daniel looked up. He met her eyes with a composure that was, if she'd been paying a different kind of attention, already notable. "I apologize," he said. "I was just finishing up." He took a small step back, adjusting the tray in his hand. "You were looking at the board," Victoria said. It was not a question. "I was," he said simply. There was a beat. Then Victoria smiled, and it was the kind of smile that meant nothing good. "Do you understand what you were looking at?" The room had gotten quieter. People were turning. The shift in atmosphere was the particular kind that happens when someone with social power decides to make a point, and everyone nearby senses the opportunity to witness something not necessarily pleasant, but interesting. Daniel did not look uncomfortable. He looked, very mildly, like someone who had been asked a question he knew the answer to, and was deciding how much of the answer to give. "The position?" "Yes," he said. "White has a structural advantage on the queen side. Black's knight is misplaced. It'll take at least 3 moves to correct. White is winning, but it's not obvious to everyone yet." There was a small silence. Victoria's smile shifted into something sharper. "You know," she said, turning slightly toward her assembled guests, with the performative ease of someone who has done this particular dance before, "I think everyone here has been to a restaurant where the server explains the wine list with just a little too much confidence." Light laughter from several people in the circle. She looked back at Daniel. And now the performance was fully on the elevated eyebrow, the slight tilt of the chin that communicated volumes about the distance between them. "What's your salary here, if you don't mind me asking?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. A few people winced, slightly, invisibly. Others leaned in. Daniel held her gaze. "I don't think that's relevant," he said pleasantly. "No, I suppose it isn't," Victoria agreed, in a tone that suggested it was extremely relevant, in exactly the way she intended. "What I'm getting at is that chess, real chess, the kind played at this level, requires a certain kind of mind, a certain kind of education, a certain kind of background." She gestured with one hand toward the board, toward the room, toward the assembled 43 people who had all achieved a certain kind of thing. "It's not a game for everyone. There's no shame in that." Daniel said nothing for a moment. Gerald Whitmore, from his position near the window, set down his champagne glass very quietly and watched. "Well," Victoria said. Pride took on the particular brightness of someone enjoying herself. "If you actually understand the game, as well as you seem to think, why don't you play? I'll give you a match." She glanced around at her guests, gathering the room's energy behind her. "If you beat me, I'll write you a check for $1 million right now." Another beat. The smile. "And if you lose, you simply acknowledge that perhaps some things are better left to those with the appropriate background. Fair?" The room erupted. Not in horror, in laughter. In the bright, excited murmur of people who have just been offered entertainment they didn't expect. The kind of scene that gets retold at other dinners, in other rooms. Some of the guests, mostly men, were already grinning. A woman near the back frowned and looked away. 2 people pulled out their phones before stopping themselves, remembering where they were. Daniel looked at the board for a moment. He set his tray down on a side table carefully, with the trained precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and looked back at Victoria Hale. He did not look angry. He did not look humiliated. He looked, in fact, like someone running a very quick internal calculation, arriving at an answer, and accepting the answer's implications without particular drama. Across the room, Gerald Whitmore stood up straighter. Something had just shifted in the quality of the serving staff member's silence, a shift Gerald recognized from decades of watching people decide to stop holding back. Victoria was still smiling, surrounded by her guests, entirely confident in the architecture of the moment she had constructed. "All right," Daniel said. "I'll play." The room had arranged itself with the instinctive efficiency of people who know how to watch something. Chairs had been repositioned. The obsidian and ivory board had been reset a full game. From the beginning, because this was not a demonstration anymore. Daniel had removed his service vest and folded it over the back of a nearby chair, rolled up the cuffs of his white shirt 2 turns, and sat down across from Victoria Hale, as if he were sitting down for something he had done before and expected to do again. Victoria controlled the white pieces. She moved first, pushing her king's pawn forward 2 squares, e4. The classical open, the aggressive choice of someone who intends to dominate from the start. It was the move of a player who wanted the game to be fast and decisive, who had seen this particular kind of opponent before, and expected a brief, slightly painful education. The assembled guests watched with the mild interest of people expecting something predictable. Daniel moved almost immediately. Not hastily, there was nothing careless about it, but without the pause that most players need when they're feeling their way into a game. His response was the Sicilian defense, c5. One of the oldest and most deeply theoretical openings in the history of the game. A choice that instantly altered the nature of what was being built on that board. It was not a defensive move in the way non-players sometimes understand defense, not a retreat, not a concession. It was the opening salvo of a counter-attacking structure that could, in the hands of someone who knew it deeply, turn an aggressive opponent's energy against them over a long and increasingly complex middle game. The move announced, to anyone fluent enough to read it, that this was not going to be a simple match, was not going to be a brief illustration of the gap between amateur curiosity and genuine expertise, was not going to conclude in the manner that Victoria and 42 of the 43 guests had already decided it would conclude. Victoria's hands paused over the board for a fraction of a second. It was barely visible, but Gerald Whitmore saw it, and noted it, and felt the small, cold premonition of someone who has seen this specific kind of pause before, and knows exactly what it means. The moment a player realizes, without yet fully accepting it, that they are not sitting across from the opponent they prepared for. She played her second move, and the game began in earnest. For the first 5 moves, the crowd murmured, and shifted. A few people glanced at each other. Someone made a quiet joke about the server taking his time. 2 guests near the windows went back to their interrupted conversation. The entertainment was supposed to be in the outcome, not the process. And the process seemed to be going more or less as expected. Victoria moved with authority. The position on the board was sharp, complex, the kind of middle game that rewarded aggression and punished hesitation, the kind Victoria had navigated successfully for 20 years against opponents far more prepared than a hotel employee on his dinner break. She pushed her development aggressively, bishops out, castled early, rooks connected. The architecture of her attack assembled with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Her guests watched her and saw what they expected to see. A woman who was very good at this, doing something she was very good at, against someone who was almost certainly not. But somewhere around the 8th move, something changed in the room's temperature. It was not a single thing. It was a convergence, the accumulation of several small details that individually meant nothing but together meant everything to anyone with the right vocabulary. It started with Thomas Reeves. Thomas was 44 years old, a former professional chess player who had competed at the national level before transitioning into financial consulting in his late 20s, and who attended events like this largely for the pleasure of watching other wealthy people play chess badly. He had been watching the game from a comfortable distance with his glass of scotch and his modest expectations, and then Daniel had played his 8th move, a subtle piece repositioning that most people in the room would have seen as simple development, and Thomas had gone very still. He set his glass down. He moved 2 steps closer to the board. Daniel's move was not aggressive. It was not flashy. It was the kind of move that only makes complete sense 6 or 7 moves later. When the position it was building towards snaps into focus, and you realize the player who made it had seen that future position long before you did. Thomas had seen moves like that before. He had seen them in tournaments. He had seen them in the games of people who had spent years studying under grandmasters, people who had internalized the language of chess at a depth that professional players recognize in each other the way musicians recognize virtuosity, not by the loudness of the performance, but by the completeness of the silence underneath it. "Who is this person?" Thomas said, quietly, mostly to himself. Victoria was leaning forward slightly over the board. The ease had left her posture, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to most people in the room, but the shoulders had squared. The neck had straightened, The eyes had settled into the focused, slightly narrowed expression of someone who has walked into a room and discovered it is larger than they expected. She was playing well. She was playing very well. But the board had acquired a quality that she was only beginning to name, a quality she associated with the handful of times in her chess career when she had sat across from someone who was genuinely better than her, and had not known it until the game was already 3/4 over and the geometry of the position had begun to make itself understood. She played her next move. Daniel looked at the board for perhaps 4 seconds, not because he needed the time, she would realize later, but because he was deciding between two continuations that were equally effective, and chose the one that was more instructive. He moved a knight to the center, f4. A square that looked exposed, that looked like an invitation, that looked like a mistake to anyone who wasn't playing at the level necessary to see that it was the opposite of a mistake. The crowd had gone quiet. The conversation near the windows had stopped. Someone had apparently texted another guest who had stepped out, because that guest now returned to the room and began threading their way toward the board. People leaned in. The room had the particular quality of a space where everyone has simultaneously understood that something they came here expecting to be entertainment has become, without warning, something else entirely. Victoria stared at the knight on f4 for a long time. Her guests watched her face. Her face, carefully maintained by years of poker training and executive presence coaching, was doing something it very rarely did in public. It was working. She was genuinely thinking. In the deep, slightly uncomfortable way that meant the easy answers weren't presenting themselves, she placed her bishop aggressively, threatening the knight a strong move. Objectively, the kind of move that would have punished most players at this level, she made it with the slight force of someone who has decided that aggression is the answer. That pressure will clarify the situation. Daniel captured the bishop. The exchange that followed 3 moves, both players taking turns removing pieces from the board, seemed, to the less experienced observers, like a rough equivalence, a tactical skirmish in which both sides had paid a price. But Thomas Reeves, standing now close enough to the board to see the specific positions clearly, made a sound in the back of his throat that caused the woman standing next to him to look at him sharply. "He's up," Thomas said softly. "Positionally. He's up. He's a waiter," she said. "He's not a waiter," Thomas said. He was looking at Daniel with an expression that had moved past surprise into something that resembled intense, concentrated recall. He was searching his memory for something. A face, a name, a game, a style of play he had seen before in a very different context. The way Daniel held his posture quiet, centered, completely without performance. The way he moved pieces without hesitation, after apparently short deliberation. The way his position on the board had been building from the very first move toward an endgame architecture that had been visible. Thomas now understood. From the beginning, all of it was beginning to coalesce into something Thomas could almost name. The name was almost there, just below the surface, associated, in his memory, with a particular style, positional, deep, relentless, in a way that never felt relentless because it was too patient to read as aggression until the moment the trap closed. Victoria was sweating, finely, controlled, the kind of perspiration that people trained in high-pressure environments suppress with iron self-discipline, but it was there. At the hairline, at the collar, in the slight increased brightness of her complexion. She had been playing for what felt like much longer than it was. Every move she chose felt like the right move in isolation and contributed. She was beginning to understand with growing unease, to a position that was systematically worse for her, as if the correct moves she was making were exactly the correct moves her opponent had expected her to make. She was not losing badly. She was losing inevitably, which was a different thing entirely, and in some ways, much harder to process. The gentleman from across the room, a sovereign wealth fund director, who played chess casually and well, had come to stand beside Thomas. He looked at the board for a long moment. Then he said, with the flat certainty of someone stating something he cannot quite believe, "He's not going to lose this." Gerald Whitmore had moved closer as well. He was watching Daniel's face more than the board, the quality of the man's attention, the way his eyes rested on the pieces, not with the darting calculation of someone working hard, but with the settled ease of someone reading a familiar language. And Gerald had been in a room like this before. Not this room, not this hotel, but this specific quality of witness. This specific flavor of recognition. He had been at a tournament, not as a player, never as a player, but as a business associate of the event's sponsor perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. And there had been a player in that tournament. Young, well, youngish, mid-30s, which in chess terms was past the prodigy phase but still enormously capable, who had played with exactly this quality. Quiet, patient, structurally devastating in a way that didn't reveal itself until it was too late. That player's name had been in the newspaper for a few days because of the result of the match, and then for a different reason, one that had nothing to do with chess. Gerald crossed the room to where Thomas Reeves was standing. He lowered his voice. "The player from the New England Championship," he said. 4. 5 years ago? What was his name? Thomas looked at him. Something clicked in his expression, the recall completing itself, the association snapping into place. He said the name quietly, a name that had been on the cover of a chess publication and briefly, for the wrong reasons, in the general press, Daniel Mercer. Not a name most people in this room would have known. But Thomas Reeves knew it. Gerald Whitmore now remembered it. And what they both knew, what the chess world had recorded with the particular specificity of people who keep detailed records, was this. In the final 4 years of his active competitive career, Daniel Mercer had not lost a single officially sanctioned match. Not one. He had retired from professional play, not because of a loss, not because of a decline in form, but because of something that happened in his personal life. Something the chess press had reported with sympathy and without detail. And then he had simply disappeared from the circuit, as players sometimes do, as quietly as water finding its way through stone. Thomas said, distinctly, to the nearest cluster of guests. This man was ranked in the top 30 nationally 4 years ago. He has not lost a rated game in the last 4 years of his competitive career. He paused. She is playing one of the strongest positional players of his generation. The information spread through the room in seconds. The way information spreads in a room of 40 people who are all paying attention to the same thing and all suddenly understand it differently. A murmur ran through the cluster near the windows, then jumped to the group near the fireplace, then reached the people standing closest to the board, a wave of recontextualization of the evening reorienting itself around a fact that changed the meaning of every moment that had preceded it. The man holding the empty tray, the quiet eyes on the board, the calm with which he had accepted a bet that was designed to humiliate him, all of it rearranged itself, in real time, into a completely different shape. What the people in that room were reckoning with was not simply the revelation of Daniel's past. It was the revelation of their own assumptions, the speed with which they had processed his uniform and arrived at conclusions that had felt like observations, but were, in fact, the quiet and socially sanctioned kind of prejudice that goes unexamined because the world keeps confirming it, again and again, until the confirmation feels like evidence rather than echo. The chessboard in front of them had become, without anyone planning it this way, something rather more unsettling than an evening's entertainment. Victoria heard it. She heard it because the room had gotten quiet enough that Thomas's voice, even lowered, carried. And she was close enough, and the words "there" and "competitive career" arrived in her mind, with the particular clarity of information received at exactly the wrong moment. She looked up from the board and found Thomas's eyes, and the expression on his face not triumphant, not mocking, but quiet and almost sympathetic, told her everything she needed to know about what she was not going to be able to do for the remainder of this game. She played 3 more moves. They were excellent moves. They were the moves of a genuinely skilled player fighting with everything she had in a position that had become, through no single dramatic mistake but through the accumulation of 100 small structural pressures, irreversible. Daniel played quietly. His face gave nothing. Not satisfaction, not concentration, not urgency. The game was not urgent for him. The game was, in some sense, already over in the part of his mind where he processed these things, and he was completing it with the care of someone finishing a task that deserves to be finished correctly. He moved his rook to the 7th rank. He looked at the position once more, running something in his mind, and then he moved his queen a clean diagonal, crossing the center of the board, and set it down with a sound that was quiet and final, and that everyone in the room, even those who couldn't fully read the position, somehow understood. "Checkmate," Daniel said. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way someone states a fact about the weather. The word went into the room and the room received it in complete silence. Victoria Hale looked at the board for a long time. The position was clear. There was no variation she hadn't considered, no line she hadn't examined, no move that hadn't already been accounted for by the structure that had been closing around her, incrementally and inexorably, since somewhere around the 15th move, she had lost. Not narrowly decisively. To a man in a hotel uniform who had been holding a tray of empty champagne glasses 20 minutes ago, she looked up from the board. 43 people looked back at her. And the silence had the particular weight of a room full of people who are feeling many things at once and haven't yet sorted out which thing to show. The laughter was gone. The easy entertainment had been replaced by something that required a different emotional vocabulary. And the room was quiet while everyone searched for it. It took Victoria Hale approximately 45 seconds to complete a process that some people never complete at all. 45 seconds, during which she sat completely still at the chessboard. Her hands folded in front of her. Her eyes on the pieces, not cataloging them, not looking for some missed defense, but receiving the full weight of what had happened, and what she had caused to happen, and what the distance was between those two things. 45 seconds of the kind of reckoning that money usually insulates people from, and that sometimes arrives anyway, in the least expected rooms. The silence in those seconds was not comfortable. It was the silence of a person running a long inventory of their own behavior, and finding that the inventory does not balance, that what was said cannot be separated from why it was said, that the performance she had put on for these 40 people had not been, as she had believed in the moment, a harmless game of social theater. It had been something crueler than that. Dressed up in the language of a bet, she had called him ineducable. She had asked about his salary as a weapon. She had told him, in front of 40 people, that chess was not a game for people like him that he was. By virtue of his uniform and his function in this room, categorically outside the circle of those who could understand or compete at this level, she had offered the $1 million, not as a genuine proposition, but as a performance of contempt, a number so large it was meant to underline the absurdity of his presence at this board. And then she had lost, completely, cleanly, in a game that had never, from the opening exchange, been particularly close. Every word she had said was still in the room. Words don't leave rooms the way they leave mouths. They stay, absorbed into the walls, into the memory of every person who heard them, available for indefinite replay. She could feel the weight of them now, which was a new sensation for Victoria Hale, who had spent most of her adult life being careful enough, or powerful enough, never to have to feel the weight of what she had said. She stood up. The movement drew every eye in the room, the way any movement draws eyes in a silence that complete. She pushed her chair back and walked around the board, not quickly, not to escape the moment, but with the deliberate movement of someone who has decided to walk directly into the thing they've been avoiding, until she was standing in front of Daniel, who had also stood, and was waiting with the patient. Neutral courtesy of someone who had spent 11 months learning how to wait in rooms like this. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said. Her voice was level. It was the voice of someone who had made the decision to say something difficult and was going to say it without softening it into meaninglessness. "I treated you with contempt because of what you were wearing, because of your job title in this room. I decided what you were capable of before I knew anything about you. And I used this room, and these people, as an audience for that decision. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The room was very still. Daniel looked at her for a moment. His expression was not vindicated, and it was not magnanimous in the showy way. It was simply present, the expression of a person hearing something said and taking it at face value. "Thank you," he said. "I made a bet," Victoria continued. And she reached into the small clutch she had carried that evening and removed her phone. She opened a transfer application with the quick efficiency of someone who has sent large amounts of money before and knows exactly how. Her fingers moved across the screen. She turned it toward Daniel so he could see the amount. $1 million. The outgoing transfer. His account information which he provided, quietly, from memory, because some numbers stay with a person regardless of what chapter of life they're living, filled in with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. She confirmed the transfer. The notification arrived, on both their phones, within seconds. I don't want you to take this as. She paused, choosing the next words carefully. Because they mattered, and she knew they mattered. As a transaction that settles something, it doesn't settle anything. I said what I said, and a check doesn't unsay it. I just want to be clear that I know that. Daniel considered this for a moment. Then he said, the money is generous. But what you just did, standing up and saying what you said in front of everyone here, that's worth more. He glanced at the room for a brief moment, not performing the gesture but simply acknowledging the reality of it. Most people don't do that. It's harder than it looks. Someone began to applaud. Gerald Whitmore, whose hands were already moving before he'd consciously decided to start. Others followed, the applause spreading through the room with the particular quality of something that everyone in the space had needed to do and had been waiting for permission to do. Not for the game, not for the money, not even entirely for the apology, but for the larger shape of the evening, for what the room had witnessed from beginning to end, for the satisfaction of watching a person discover the boundary of their own assumptions and choose, at the hardest possible moment, to step across it rather than away from it. Daniel let the applause settle. He picked up his folded vest from the chair behind him. He looked at Victoria one more time, and his expression was entirely without triumph or resentment. It was the expression of someone who has been in a difficult place for a long time, and is, perhaps, incrementally, beginning to remember something about himself. I used to play professionally, he said, matter-of-factly. The way you'd mention a job you used to have. I stepped away when my family needed me to. I don't regret it. A brief pause. I'm glad I remembered I could still play. He put the vest back on. He picked up his tray from the side table. He walked back through the room the way he had come in, quietly, efficiently, without theater, and returned to the service corridor. And the hotel resumed around him the way hotels always do, continuous, unhurried, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding in its interior. But the room he left behind was different from the room he had entered. Not loudly different, not in a way that would have been obvious to someone who hadn't been there for the whole arc of the evening. But the people in that room had been changed, in the specific small way that witnessing a true thing changes people, not dramatically, not immediately, but in the gradual way that real experiences alter the internal architecture of how a person moves through the world. They had watched a woman of extraordinary achievement and genuine intelligence make an ordinary human mistake, the mistake of using status as a lens through which to evaluate worth, and then watched her pay a price for it that money could not fully explain, and then watched her do the harder thing, which was to stand up in front of her peers and say so. Thomas Reeves later looked up Daniel Mercer's competitive record on a database he'd been using since his own tournament days. The record was exactly as his memory had reconstructed it. 41 consecutive wins in rated competition in his final active years, 0 losses. 3 major regional titles, several wins against internationally ranked masters. A competitive graph that had been climbing steeply when it simply stopped. The way a river stops when it reaches a place where it needs to go underground for a while. Where it does its work without being observed. Where it flows on in the dark. Thomas sat with the database open on his screen for a long time that night, longer than the task required. Reading the match notations, the individual games preserved in algebraic notation, each one a window into a mind that had been operating at a level that most players spend their entire careers working toward and never quite reaching. He thought about the version of that mind he had witnessed across a chessboard that evening. Slightly rusty at the edges, perhaps. Perhaps slightly slower than it had been at its peak, but still unmistakably shaped by something deep and long and serious. He thought about the vest, the silver nameplate, the empty champagne flutes on the tray. He thought about the ease with which all of them had assigned meaning to those things. He closed the database, and he sat in his apartment looking at the far wall for a while in the specific stillness of a person revising something important. Gerald Whitmore called the hotel's general manager the next morning not to report anything, not to complain or commend in any official way, but to ask, quietly, about the employee named Daniel Mercer. What he was told did not surprise him. A good worker, reliable, private. Came in when he said he would, left when he was supposed to, kept largely to himself, and caused no one any trouble. The general manager asked if there was a concern, and Gerald said no. No concern at all. Just curiosity. He thanked the manager and hung up and sat for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has spent a life watching the world sort people into categories, and is thinking, perhaps more carefully than usual, about the limits of the sorting. Victoria Hale was in a board meeting at 9 the next morning, as she always was on Wednesday mornings, presiding with her customary authority over a table of 14 people who had prepared extensively for her questions. She ran the meeting the way she always ran it, precisely, incisively, without wasted time. At the end of it, she asked her executive assistant to send a full catering bonus to the service staff of the Alderton Grand, who had worked the salon the previous evening, with a note that cited exceptional professionalism. She did not explain the note to her assistant, and her assistant, who knew better than to ask, sent it without comment. In the service corridors of the Alderton Grand, among the people who worked there, the banquet servers, the housekeeping staff, the kitchen workers, the facilities team that ran the infrastructure of the place, the story of what had happened in the 14th floor salon moved quickly, and in the particular way that stories move among people who have been working in the service industry their whole lives, and have developed a deep, collective archive of stories about the way the world treats people who work with their hands. It circulated not as gossip, not as complaint, but with the specific warmth of something that felt, finally, like justice, the quiet, unglamorous, entirely real kind, the kind that doesn't get written up in financial publications but that the people closest to it carry with them for a long time. And in that archive, the name Daniel Mercer took on a new quality. Not different from before, he was still the same man, still the quiet one who read on his breaks and covered shifts and made good coffee, but layered, now, with the knowledge of what he had once been and had set aside, and what had happened when the world, for a single evening, had created the conditions for it to surface. His colleagues looked at him, in the days that followed, with a kind of warm recognition that he received with the same unhurried grace he brought to everything. Not uncomfortable with it, not dismissive of it, just at ease with it, in the way that people are at ease with being seen truly, when they have spent a long time being invisible by choice. He went on doing his work. He showed up when he was supposed to. He kept to himself in the ways he had always kept to himself. Sometimes on his breaks, he still walked past the room where the salon had been held, past the cabinet where the chessboard was stored in its felt-lined case, and something in him was quiet and settled in the way that things are quiet when they have been returned to their proper place, not resolved, not concluded, but properly placed, properly acknowledged, properly named. He did not seek out new attention. He did not leverage the evening into something else. He was, as he had always been, a man who had made a clear-eyed decision about what mattered to him, and was living inside that decision without apology or explanation. And that, perhaps, was the last lesson the evening had to offer, the one the room had been least prepared for, that the person who had walked away from the applause, and the $1 million, and the suddenly revised opinions of 40 influential people, and gone back to doing his job, was not diminished by the return. He was, in fact, exactly as large afterward as he had been before any of them had noticed him. The only thing that had changed was their ability to see it. There is a particular kind of wealth that no balance sheet has ever captured, and no acquisition has ever delivered, and no performance review has ever measured. It is the wealth of being known accurately, of having the world, even briefly, even in a single room on a single November evening, see the full dimension of what a person carries. Most people spend their lives in the gap between who they are and who the world decides they are. And they learn, eventually, to stop noticing the gap, to fold it into the ordinary fabric of daily experience until it becomes invisible. But it is never actually absent. It is always there, waiting patient, in the way that the deep and true things are always patient for the conditions that allow it to surface. The world does not often create those moments. The overlap between the life a person contains and the life the world allows them to display is almost never exact, almost never complete, and the gap between them is usually so familiar that it stops registering as a gap at all and starts feeling like simply the shape of things. Daniel Mercer had lived in that gap for a long time. He had not been unhappy in it. There is more than one kind of life worth living, and he had made his choice with full understanding of what he was choosing and why. But something had shifted that Tuesday evening in November, in the quality of the gap. Not closed, not eliminated, just acknowledged. And acknowledgement, it turns out, is its own kind of arrival. The obsidian queen still stood on her starting square in the felt-lined case. The city still pressed its light against the hotel windows. The world still sorted people, with its usual confidence and usual inaccuracy, into the categories it preferred. But in one room, on one evening, the sorting had been interrupted by a man who had said yes to a chess game, and then played it honestly, and by a woman who had been wrong about something important and had found, in the difficult silence after the last move, the willingness to say so. Sometimes the most important move on any board is the one you make after the game is already over. Sometimes the bravest thing a person does happens not in the winning but in the standing up afterward, in the walking across the room toward the person you underestimated, in the choosing of words that cost something real. The board always tells you where the pieces are. It never tells you who the players are. That part, the essential part, the part that cannot be extracted from the visible surface of things, the part that has nothing to do with titles or uniforms or the particular angle of a chandelier's light, takes longer to understand and requires a different kind of attention entirely, and is more often than not concealed beneath the most ordinary-looking circumstances, the most overlooked faces, the most quietly extraordinary hands. And the hardest part of all is not learning this lesson once, in a specific room, on a specific November evening. The hardest part is carrying it forward into every ordinary room afterward, into every assumption you are about to make, before the person in front of you has had a single chance to show you who they are.